Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week we'll be reviewing Cloudsplitter by Russell Banks. This will be a full spoiler review, so if you've not read Cloudsplitter, it's a historical fiction novel, so I'm not sure what would constitute a spoiler and what would not constitute a spoiler, so I'm going to say full spoilers. Russell Banks was an American author. He did pass away a few years ago, known for this novel as well as a novel called The Sweet Hereafter and Affliction, both of which were made into movies. Cloudsplitter was nominated for a PEN Faulkner, so it did get some esteem while it came out. Russell Banks, was also, I believe, won the Don Passos Award one year, and so he was a real well regarded author in his time. Was born in Massachusetts and wrote for most of, I think, beginning in the early 1980s until he passed away. Like I said, probably 2020, 2022. This novel is the life and times of John Brown, the abolitionist, best known for his raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. That was a flashpoint for the Civil War. And Banks does this ingenious thing, which is that the novel is told through letters that Owen Brown, who is John Brown's third son, is sending to a biographer of John Brown 40 years after John Brown's execution. Um, this gives the novel this kind of yes and quality to it, where it's a story about John Brown, but it's really also, maybe even more so, a story about his son who is living in something of the shadow. You kind of have this repeated analogy of someone living in the shadow of another person, and Owen Brown coming to grips with his role in what happened, um, as far as the violence that followed John Brown towards the end of his life, and Owen Brown's role in that, and his own role in his faith in God, and all these things that are a really really interesting novel. So it's kind of about John Brown, but really even more so, it's really about his son and his son's in some ways inability to escape his father's control. And I think that gave the novel really a psychological depth that I wasn't expecting, and I think it made it very contemporary. And I think it's a novel that will be read for a very long time because of that. The other thing that I think Banks does extremely well is he kind of gives it this political climate, so you understand as a historical fiction novel the lives of these characters and the things that they're going through, and how it felt like oftentimes in history, maybe this is the difference between two paragraphs in a history book and a 750-page novel, but you get really the the deep understanding of what is happening to these characters, how they feel about things, the world that is around them that feels real, characters that feel real, and how they're kind of pushed to do things due to political changes in the system, as well as their own circumstances. The novel goes over really up till his Brown's execution. Um, the raid at Harper's Ferry is kind of the last, I'd say, 10% of the book. Starts off with their life in Ohio. We learn about John Brown's attempt to be like a legitimate businessman and how he's kind of thwarted, sometimes through his own naivete, sometimes through his own overselling of his ability to do things. He's kind of chased by creditors for most of his life. Then they move to New York as part of a gift that is given to him by someone who is in the abolitionist movement, and kind of their life there before moving to Kansas, and then moving to the raid on Harper's Ferry. Like I said, it's about the last 10% of the book. And during that time, we learn about Owen Brown and his life. He is, as I mentioned, kind of the third son, and he's kind of looked over oftentimes because he has I don't know if I would call it, it's a physical injury. I guess he walks off of a roof at one point when he's a child, and I'm not sure if the arm is completely immobilized, but he injures his arm. And I think this causes people to, in some ways, overlook him. Throughout the book, he has a lot of self doubt and kind of constantly refers to himself as a liar. The framework of the novel is him sending papers back to the novel is technically set in 1899, which is about 40 years after the raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown and most of uh, the people there who were part of um, the group of about 20 raiders are executed. Most of Owen's family has died 40 years later, and so this 40-year framework In 1899, he's sending papers to Miss Mayo, who is John Brown's biographer, a biographer of John Brown. So the framework is Owen Brown has moved to California. He's like one of the last surviving people in this family, and he is sending these papers to get kind of his side of the story to one of John Brown's biographers. And it gives him this kind of yes and quality of the book where Banks is able to look at Brown with enough distance from a character who doesn't always agree with him and to kind of question some of his motives and some kind of question some of his beliefs. And it gives it kind of this duality of the novel where you do feel sorry for Owen Brown as someone who's not fully really his own man. There's one part towards the end of the book where there's a brief image of what could have been that is kind of quickly dispatched by his dad, and I really enjoyed those aspects of the book. The thing the book does the best to me is just understanding the life of how hard it was for people who were living in this time period and how hard scrabble everything was. There's one point in the book where, because John Brown has been haunted by creditors, chased by creditors, he is declared bankruptcy, and one of the things that he's allowed to do, he has a list of his possessions he's allowed to keep, and it's a very, very short list for a family, a huge family. At one point, I think they Owen says that John Brown had 20 children. They don't all make it to adulthood. He has an even shorter list of those people who make it to adulthood, and you just get a sense of how hard it is. There's one winter where 4 of them die, and it just happens, and the book just kind of keeps moving. And so you just get a sense of how difficult life was for everyone during this time. And this family is driven by John Brown's hatred for slavery, and a lot of the book is him talking about how this drives him to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad and how his religious beliefs have set him apart from the abolitionist movement, which he feels is too, I think he calls them Boston ladies at one point, but basically the point is they are willing in the abolitionist movement, which is there's white society in the North that doesn't particularly care, that is very apathetic to this thing, and there's a smaller portion of people who are abolitionists, and those people he feels a certain distance from because they're not willing to go far enough in what they're willing to do. And so a lot of the book is the feeling of this family dealing with what they call the racialist issue of racism in America during the time, and how the Brown family is kind of their own almost entity because they can't fit in anywhere. They don't fit in with white people. They don't fit in with black people. They're just kind of their own thing. And that is kind of a constant throughout the book of how just strange this family is compared to everybody else, and the absolute degree to which John Brown holds to his beliefs and what he's willing to do to fight against slavery. And again, you get the political context of all this stuff, so you do see this. One of the things that I think Banks is doing is this escalation of how do you go from someone who is on one hand a very faithful practicing Christian who, to the point where early on in the book, when Owen is a child, there's a story of him stealing his grandfather's watch, which is one of the few possessions of luxury this family has, and he is whipped by John Brown, and John Brown then, after that, asks Owen to whip him because he failed his father to allow Owen to get to the point where he's stealing the watch. And so you just get this constant sense of how in this world of very hard scrabble people, John Brown is one tier above everybody in terms of his just ardent, the amount that he sticks to the beliefs that he has. And you get in kind of the psychology of Owen Brown and his relationship with his stepmother that is kind of frosty, and his relationship with his brothers and sisters, which is interesting. So it's one of the best historical fiction novels I've ever read in terms of making the world feel like a contemporary world, even though it's set in this time that almost none of us really could faithfully understand and truly say that we understood it. But because the complexities are there, and because the characters are treated as three-dimensional characters with different wants and needs and desires, it makes you feel like you're there in terms of what these characters are going through. Banks kind of talks about the political climate from the viewpoint of the Brown family, where the Fugitive Slave Act has been passed, and that's kind of the catalyst for the second half of the novel, where you have them moving to Kansas. You have John Brown's failures as I don't know if he would be considered a like a finder's fee, but his failures in business, where he is basically part of a almost like a commodities futures wool person, where he's trying to speculate on the wool market, and that kind of blows up in his face. Because this happens, he has basically gives up on becoming a successful businessman, and then kind of goes and begins to lead this life of being this really strident, violent abolitionist who's willing to kill people for his beliefs. And he has his family who is backing him up, and he's able to gather followers to his cause. And that kind of starts off, I'd say, the second half, or probably second half, maybe the last, I don't know, 40% of the novel. And then you get the psychology because it's almost like the true story. You have kind of Owen Brown and how his ability to kind of push his father over the edge, and the relationship and interplay between the two of them, I thought was also really interesting. So I thought that was all really, really powerful and really great stuff. I guess on the downside, relatively small things I didn't like about the novel, I guess I would say it is 750 pages, and there are some parts of it. While I understand what Banks is doing for effect, there's a part in the book where John Brown is writing to The Liberator, which is a black newspaper, and he's kind of becoming this character that he's using to kind of give advice to black Americans. I understood what he was doing. I don't know if that needed to be in the novel for lengthwise. I think that could have been taken out because I think that is there in other places in the book, and it could have been kind of condensed. And so you do, sometimes you feel like this is the entire story of John Brown, where you could have maybe kind of compressed some stuff. There's a whole time where they're in London. There's a part in the novel where you have Owen Brown, his flowering into adulthood, I guess is a way to say it. I don't know if you really need that. There's parts in the book that were plot points where some things are not as clear as they maybe could have been. There's a part where the whole thing with the wool speculation, that was written in a way that wasn't quite clear what was going on. There's a character named Lyman Epps who's a major character in the book. His relationship with Owen is a little strange. I think that's on purpose, but there's a specific thing that happens in that during the two of them where it wasn't quite clear what exactly has happened. His relationship and feelings towards Lyman are also kind of weird, and so I don't know how much of that is because Banks is trying to do that on purpose, and how much of that was just kind of bad writing. One of the things that's difficult to deal with the historical novels is that I don't know how much of it is really true and how much of it needed to be there, how much of it could have been condensed. And I felt that after reading it, I think a lot of it is very, very well done. The only other major point that I thought was difficult was, and this is one of the things where his relationship with Mary, who is his stepmother, she has very, very few lines given how major of a character she is. I don't know, again, if that's Banks's comment on Owen's feelings about her, his comments on women during that time, or if she just didn't have his comment, or just the real life position of women who would have been in this family. It's not quite clear. And then the major problem I had with it, the last 10%, the raid on Harper's Ferry, after it ends, it just kind of ends. It was a book that was kind of almost missing a prologue in some ways. So I felt like the ending just kind of suddenly ended. There's one part earlier in the book that probably could have served as a prologue, but I think he moved it up for effect. And that's the part where Owen is going back to, the name of the book is called Cloudsplitter. Cloudsplitter is a mountain in New York where the Brown family had their farm. And it is in the kind of shadows of this mountain, which I believe is called, I believe the indigenous word for it is something to the effect of Talwis, which is Cloudsplitter. And this is where they have their family farm in New York. Owen has gone back to this family farm at one point in the novel there's a commemoration of the day that I believe that John Brown has died, and there's a giant boulder with the people who have died at Harper's Ferry that's inscribed in this boulder. I don't know, that part of me thinks that could have been your epilogue instead of having it where it is, but he doesn't do that, and so the book just kind of ends. And so it's a little bit of an anticlimactic ending in some ways, and I don't know what the best way to have done it would have been, but the book just kind of feels like it just ends kind of abruptly. And given it's a 750-page book, I was expecting a little bit more of a flowery ending on that. But I really enjoyed the book. Overall, there's a lot of meat on the bone there. It is a lot of book, but I also think that the ability for Banks to create these really three-dimensional characters who you empathize with, even if you question the decisions that they make and why they're doing what they're doing, I thought was really powerful stuff, and I would recommend it to people who like historical novels. I would recommend it to people who are Civil War buffs. I would recommend it to people who want something that I guess I would recommend it to people who are just like, I want to read a historical novel. I don't know anything about the period. I don't think you have to be an expert in any of this stuff, because I think that Banks does a good enough job of dropping you in with enough knowledge to understand the feelings of these people versus the feelings of the community as a whole, and how, just because this family and their beliefs is so unique to themselves, and they go everywhere they go, they're kind of outcasts and seen as crazy. You don't really need to know the broader political dynamics of the United States during that time. I'm sure it helps, but you don't really need it. And the other thing, kind of to the length, there's times in the books where John Brown is giving speeches. There's a lot of speechifying, and that all could have been shortened. There's a part where I think it's either Emerson or Thoreau. I forget which one it was, but one of them is in the novel. I don't know if he needs to be in the novel. Last thing, Owen Brown, his arm injury. It seems to come and go how important this arm injury is, because at one point he's able to, doesn't seem to be put off by it. Other times he says it's an issue. So that kind of, sometimes you forget if he has an arm injury or not. Sometimes I get the sense that Banks forgot whether or not he had an arm injury. So I don't know to the degree to which the arm is actually injured is kind of a question. He, at one point, Owen Brown gets into a fight with a bunch of people, and no one seems to comment that he has what is essentially an arm that he can't fully use. And I thought that was kind of strange. But overall, really enjoyed it. Cloudsplitter, Russell Banks. For anybody who has read it, I'm sure people have read it. Please feel free to leave me a link, comment below if you've read it, if you enjoyed it. If you did not finish it, which I have a feeling that some people, I was carried through with it. I was able to keep going. The audiobook is like 30 hours. I also started listening to the audiobook and went back to the book itself, because I thought that the narrator wasn't really doing it for me. So if you get a chance, I, again, would really recommend Cloudsplitter by Russell Banks. If you've enjoyed this, please feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll leave my link to the Twitter below. Until next time, bye.